Well, hey there, YouTube. Welcome to Monday's edition of The Breakfast Club. I'm Got That Funk. I'd like to thank you for joining me. I'd also like to thank my friend Kizzume who made a video on his channel yesterday, which I found quite compelling. I'll link it in the description box below. The video is called Promoting War is Not Peaceful, or Promoting Civil War is Not Peaceful. Now, the title sounds pretty obvious, right? You would think that promoting any kind of violence is not peaceful, but there are apparently some people on YouTube who seem to espouse violent solutions or aggressive solutions to the problems that are faced by certain marginalized groups. And much to the chagrin of Kizzume, some of these people seem to be invoking the memories of the 1960s and saying they want to sort of revive the countercultural aspirations and memories of the 1960s, and that their movement is akin in some way to the movements of the 1960s. And like I said, Kizzume took issue with that, and so do I, frankly. I mean, if you're saying that you know, you need to have a revolution, a violent revolution of whatever sort you might envisage, that is pretty much contrary to the 1960s. In the 1960s, people were talking about revolution, but I don't think anyone was talking about sort of overthrowing the government, or necessarily, they were talking about changing the status quo by changing people's minds. Yeah? From my point of view, I lived through the 1960s, okay? And although the civil rights movement was far away from where I grew up, I was aware of it happening at the time. I think it's worth remembering that people like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, while they were alive, were not necessarily revered as the cultural heroes at the time that they are revered as now. Malcolm X in particular used to rub a lot of people up the wrong way, and Martin Luther King, although he had perhaps a little bit more broad respect across the spectrum, he was still considered to be something of a thorn in the side of the establishment. And we now know, of course, that the FBI had infiltrated the Nation of Islam and spied on Malcolm X. They might have even been aware that he was about to be killed and didn't do anything about it. But that's, you know, popular speculation, but it is speculation. As regards Martin Luther King, of course, despite the fact that he was more well regarded in the mainstream press than Malcolm X, as I say, he was considered to be something of a renegade, something of a thorn in the side of the establishment, and therefore someone to be a bit leery of. It's only after their deaths and the subsequent understanding of what they actually achieved in their lives that people started to revere them a little bit more as cultural heroes, and rightly so. I mean, you know, who knows where America would be if it wasn't for people like that. So yeah, my memories of the 60s are, for the most part, the last half of the 60s, and I was in San Francisco during the Summer of Love. I have very clear memories of it. The countercultural things that were going on in the 60s, you know, there was an awful lot. The civil rights movement contained within it an awful lot of riots. Okay, so if that's what these people are talking about, what that Kizzume is talking about in his video, and they want to emulate that part of the 1960s, in my opinion, they're trying to emulate the wrong part of the 1960s. The real part of the 1960s, worthy of emulation, worthy of trying to reclaim, is the peace and love movements of the 1960s. The movements against the war, the movements in favor of getting along. Lines from songs like Everybody Get Together, you know, come on people now, smile on your brother, everybody get together and love one another right now. Marvin Gaye, only love can conquer hate. I'm pretty sure he's paraphrasing Martin Luther King when he said that. But this was the message of the 1960s for me. This is the message, the overriding message. You can look at all sorts of pop culture in the 1960s, and it was all about peace. It was all about love. Okay? The 60s, though, let's be honest, was a turbulent time. Like I say, the civil rights movement included an awful lot of riots. In 1967, there were riots in more than 100 cities in America. In 1968, especially after the assassination of Martin Luther King, there were riots in more than 200 cities in America. there was also political assassinations. You had Medgar Evers, you had John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King. All of those I would consider to be political assassinations. And thankfully, that's not really something that we have going on right now. So when people say that things are worse now than they've ever been, I do look back at the 1960s and say, really? Because the 60s was full of hope and promise at the end of the 60s, yeah? But during the beginning and middle of it, it wasn't quite so black and white. The country looked like it was going down the toilet, you know, with all those riots going on, the political assassinations, which just kept coming all the way through the decade. People thought they were losing the country, and we should be grateful that it's not that bad now, and we should definitely strive not to let it get that bad. If you're invoking the 1960s countercultural movements and you have in mind, you know, that we need to riot like we used to, you've got it wrong. You're emulating the wrong part of the 60s. Only love can conquer hate. Only patience can solve the problems that we have. You know, patience itself won't solve the problems that we have, but without patience, you can't solve problems. Okay? You need patience, resolve, goodwill, and effort to solve any problem. When it comes to the problems that are faced by marginalized groups in our society, I think that we shouldn't neglect those problems or try to overlook them or minimalize them in any way. We should acknowledge what they are, but we should also realize the limitations of what is achievable. And the way I look at any problem is like this, you know, I try to imagine what things would look like if I could have it exactly the way I wanted it. Then I look at my situation now and I try to imagine a realistic path between where I am and where I want to be. And I think that's the way it should work for the culture. If people in marginalized groups think that their best hope against being marginalized is to basically marginalize those who are marginalizing them, that's not going to work. You know, you don't get equality by bringing down people who are privileged down to the lesser privileged. You get equality by bringing the lesser privileged up to the same status as the privileged. That's my opinion. But what do you think? I'm curious. I'd like to hear all about it, so let me know in the comment section down below. I'll be back again next week on Monday. Tomorrow, I think, we've got Sister Danger back on The Breakfast Club, finally. And I'm looking forward to seeing what she's got to say. And I look forward to hearing from you in the comments section. Until next time, may all your ups and downs be ups.